My name is Mona Rishmawi. I am the Chief of the Rule of Law in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I would like to welcome you very much for this seminar and this session on building trust in governance through the rule of law-based policy making. We are all living in a very exceptional situation, and COVID-19 has put the spotlight on the implementation of Goal 16, which is the goal, as we know, is really the keys, the center goal for our discussion today. The emergency responses to the pandemic has often suspended constitutional frameworks, amended administrative procedures, restricted public movements, limited opportunities for participation. As I'm talking to you in 2 hours, I'll be under confinement, I'll be under curfew actually in 2 hours, so I cannot leave my own house. And so it is an exceptional time. And in these exceptional times, it's very important to build confidence in governance and to have confidence in governance. So, and some very exceptional measures have to be, some measures have to be taken, important constitutional measures had to be taken under these exceptional circumstances, elections, for example. Today we'll be focusing, we have 5 very distinguished speakers who will guide us through and walk us through very important issues. For example, how do we look at the rule of law in this environment that we are based on? What are the defining characteristics of the rule of law? How do we approach recovery and a crisis response to this situation from a rule of law perspective? What are some of the examples and policies, and in terms of policy, legislative and other processes to ensure adherence to the rule of law? And what lessons we can learn from this experience to prevent human rights violations, uphold human rights during this crisis, and enable effective and inclusive government during the COVID-19. Other issues that we will be discussing is how best to align national and international legal frameworks, how we can have gender perspective. As we will hear, I think the gender component of the measures that and the impact of on particularly women and girls during this crisis has been great and has been extremely big. So how do we actually go through this situation in the way that we are to make sure that we are in a transparent, accountable, participatory manner? Another question that we'll be addressing: how do we ensure rule of law and human rights are fully respected, and how do we have an institutional mechanisms and how they can be utilized to advance the rule of law? So as I mentioned, I have with me really a fantastic panel, and I would like to start by introducing my first panelist today, who is Waven Waganda. We will be using first names. My name is Mona, so you can all call me Mona. And first speaker actually is Waven. She's from the global network of women peace builders. She's, as you see, she's a young human rights activist from Kenya. She's through her very interesting blog, Beyond the Lines, she's been really challenging and changing narratives around violence, extremism, and talking particularly about how we can educate communities online on this. I can, of course, introduce her in a much lengthier way, but I think it will be more interesting to hear her talking to us about some of the ways forward from COVID-19 and what she learned from her work until today. Waven, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mona. I'm pleased to be part of this panel today and to speak about a topic that is very close to my heart, the rule of law and human rights. I've been an activist for the past 3 years. I work in Mombasa, which is also the town in which I was born and raised in. And when the pandemic hit, my friend and I, we started an initiative called Mutual Aid Kenya, based on a radical approach to support communities and fill in the gaps where government was failing in its mandate. The pandemic has shown us how we really need to do more in terms of crisis preparedness and in terms of strengthening our governance systems to address the challenges that have been brought about by the pandemic. In addition to limited movement, we know that since the pandemic, in countries such as Kenya, we've had an increased cases of violence, police brutality, domestic violence, gender-based violence, and these are all violations of human rights. We've had limited access to social services, and we've also had limited public participation. And some of these challenges are what informed Mutual Aid Kenya's activities, one of which was political participation. So in the event where communities are expected to stay home and isolate, how do you ensure that local communities, especially those in slums, in rural communities, and those who do not have access to the internet, continue to participate in processes? And so we were able to collect data from homes and submit to the Senate of Kenya in terms of preparing the pandemic response management bill. And this was one of the ways to ensure that public participation goes on despite the challenges that have been brought about it. The rule of law based approach has to be rooted in upholding the rights of all people. And although we are all in a pandemic, it has affected us differently, some more than others. And for communities that were already vulnerable, the situation only got worse. We need to be able to hold governance structures and systems accountable for upholding the rights of minority groups and ensuring that even during a crisis, women and especially women can continue to access important social services such as maternal care and health services. And formulation of COVID-19 response and recovery plans have to be rooted on human rights and take a rights-based approach. This is the only way to make them feasible and also sustainable. Additionally, I believe that the crisis response have to align to frameworks that were already existing. For instance, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Resolution 1325, the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, Resolution 2250, that really highlights the importance of participation, especially, and seeing how what are some of the gaps in implementing this agenda that have been brought about by the pandemic, one of which has got to be participation because of the limited access to virtual spaces. But I just wanted to also give my recommendations in that if we are to take a rule of law based approach in our COVID-19 response and recovery plans, first of all, we need to ensure that all the restrictions, all the laws and policies uphold the dignity of everyone. I say this because there were instances where government officials in different countries were breaking laws, at the same time instigating violence on those who are breaking the same laws. So for example, if your member of parliament is breaking the curfew, not because he's responding to an issue, but because they can, when if I break the curfew, I would probably be beaten by the police and all that. This continues to reduce the trust that communities have, especially local communities. So all laws and restrictions have to cut across everyone. And then they also need to be affirmative and take into account that not all groups are the same, and some groups have more needs than others, particularly during this crisis. So when we're talking about digital education, what are some of the actions that are being taken to ensure that young people from rural communities can access this education? And then strengthening justice mechanisms. we know that the formal justice system involves going physically to court. How about in communities where right now courts are being held virtually and they cannot access these spaces? This means delayed justice, and you know what they say about delayed justice, being denied justice. And finally, and most importantly, is to work with community leaders who already have the trust of the communities, because at a time where there's a lot of mistrust, misinformation, and disinformation on the pandemic itself, and also right now with the vaccine, it's important that we take a holistic approach, collaborate and partner amongst different stakeholders to ensure that we prioritize the needs of our communities, and to really ensure that their dignity and rights are upheld. Thank you.
I really have to thank you with this such a powerful start from really not only a young voice, but a very wise voice. I really love how you started with the importance of participation, because I really think that's really the key point. The key point is how everybody is brought into the measures. We all need these measures. We know that safety is very important. We know that we want to stop the spread of the pandemic but to do that in a way that is trustworthy, and the key to that is participation. I also very much like how you spoke about equality before the law, but equality in dignity, and equality in dignity and rights. So it's not like we are all need to be beaten up, and we all need to be, our dignity needs to be upheld. And I very much appreciate how you brought in the importance of women and minorities also, and how important, the specificities of the two groups, and how we look at this from an inclusive point of view. So thank you very much for this very powerful first start. My second panelist is the director of the legal transition in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Michel Nussbaumer. He worked for 3 years as counsel in the banking operations, and so he has very practical experience. And because he's responsible for the legal aspects of various investments in the European Bank, with focus on medium-sized enterprises and financing. And as we know, during the pandemic, this was really these enterprises these medium-sized enterprises has been amongst the most hit. So, Michelle, if you can walk us some of the issues about how we can uphold the rule of law from your perspective as a lawyer, but also from your perspective as working in the financial system in this very difficult crisis that we are living in. Michelle, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mona. Everybody, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as we have already heard today, we have to be extremely vigilant during the COVID-19 period and make sure that governments do not curtail the rule of law without good reasons. This is really crucial to maintain the confidence of citizens in the public governance of their countries. Now, just a few words about the program I'm responsible for. Besides being a financing institution for promoting the market economy in Eastern European and Arab countries, our bank, the EBRD, is also an advisor to governments. And our legal transition program at the EBRD focuses on developing better commercial law systems in our country's operations. So we advise governments on their legislative reforms and on institution building measures in the commercial area. And by the way, we are very happy to collaborate with IDLO on a number of initiatives, in particular in the field of building judicial capacity. So my contribution to this panel will be a bit more in the area of commercial law, quite different from the previous speaker who was more focused on human rights. But in the end, I believe that the basic principles are the same. So regarding the risk of limiting the rule of law during the pandemic, I would like to share with you a story from Moldova regarding public procurement. During the COVID-19 pandemic, public procurement has become very important to address the urgent need for medical equipment to respond to the challenge. We have observed a rush to enact emergency procurement regulations in various countries. Suddenly, public procurement has become a matter of life or death because there were shortages of personal protective equipment for health workers and of ventilators. So everyone started saying public procurement has to be quick, otherwise people will die. But some of the emergency procurement policies proposed by governments were not in line with the concept of rule of law and best practices. So what happened in Moldova? Just to give you a bit of background, Moldova is a small country that suffers from political instability, a frozen conflict in Transnistria region. In addition, the country has experienced a huge population decline from 3.3 to 2.7 million during the last 10 years due to massive immigration. Health professionals have left to go work abroad, and 20% of medical personnel is over retirement age. So access to healthcare is the #1 concern for citizens. Now, the government has slowly been modernizing public procurement and has launched a national electronic platform called M-Tender in 2018, and our bank has actually provided assistance in this process. But in March 2020, when the pandemic hit, the government of Moldova responded by suspending public procurement laws for the medical sector during the period of the state of emergency. So emergency procurement for low value was allowed by direct contracting without the use of electronic systems, and contracts were not recorded in the usual way. And in addition, due to the difficulty of conducting negotiations with suppliers during the lockdown, the largest public healthcare buyer decided that they would allow collecting offers for public contracts by email. But as you can imagine, offers made by email are prone to manipulation. And this derogation from the general legal rules was not in line with best practice. So this whole approach was neither transparent nor efficient. And there was a very strong reaction by civil society, which is a really interesting moment here. So civil society was asking for transparency in spending. And there was a group called the Civil Society Coalition for COVID-19, and they created a platform called Tender Health to report spending on public procurement for COVID-19. And their aim was to provide some transparency in the process. And then, learning from the information published on that platform, the Ministry of Health of Moldova realized that there were problems and set up a working group to review the situation. And thanks to this crusade led by the civic movement in Moldova, in October 2020, the government reconsidered the policy and changed the emergency public procurement regulations. So an obligation to tender medical procurement online on the official platform was reintroduced from 1st January 2021. And all public contracts, regardless of their value, have to be reported on the online public contract database. So this was a happy ending to the problem, and the rule of law principles were reinstated. So in Moldova, I think we have learned 2 lessons from this story. The first lesson is about creating public trust in governments through the use of digital tools to share information with the public. The COVID-19 lockdowns have shown that digital procurement is a crucial component of the public governance system. It is not a luxury item. Speed, competition, and economy of procurement could not be achieved without digital tools. And just to make a comparison, compared to this learning by trial and error in Moldova, in another country, in Ukraine, all emergency public procurement, including medical products, has been kept electronic in the national e-procurement system, Prozoro, and subject to online civic monitoring. So public officers there were able to work from home and get things done to a good standard. So Ukraine got it right in the first place. The second lesson from the Moldova story relates to protecting the rule of law in line with SDG 16 during the COVID times. And that Moldovan story shows the importance of the reaction by civil society. They were crucial in exposing the problems, getting the government to react by reinstating the rule of law. So of course, other stakeholders could also help check government's actions and reinstate the rule of law. This could be parliament, this could be local governments or international organizations through their policy dialogue. But the role of civil society is particularly important in this process. So this was the short story I wanted to share with you with its lessons learned, and I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Michelle, thank you so much, because you actually added Waven has really talked about one component of the one essential ingredients of the rule of law, which is participation. And you talked about two other ones that I think are equally essential: transparency and legitimacy or legality. So you spoke about the law and you spoke about the importance that the law is actually monitored, and the role of civil society and the various groups, and to make it accessible for people to look at it. And the case of Moldova is really interesting because it shows, how not only that, that the rule of law is not a stick. It could be really a carrot for states. You can actually adjust. And I like how Moldova adjusted. I like the change that happened at the end, because that's actually what the rule of law offers, is really a way to adjust practices to make sure that it is within this overall component. So I really very much grateful to you for talking about the participation, the role of civil society, the importance of rule-based systems and a transparent rule-based system. And you said you didn't talk about human rights. Actually, all what you said is about human rights. So I'm very, very grateful to you for that as well. So my next speaker is Spiros, and Spiros is yes, Spiros is Greek, and I have infinity with Greece, so it's okay. I think I'm pronouncing his first name right, but maybe not the second name. Phlogiatis is the director of the European Public Law Organization, and is the president of its board of directors. I'd like to give you the floor, but before I give you the floor, Spiros, I really would like to thank the organizers of this panel. I really would like to thank IDLO for bringing us all together and for bringing such a fantastic group of people and fantastic speakers to this format. So please, Spiros, I think you are going to enlighten us about another aspect of the rule of law, another ingredients of the rule of law through and what can be done in this during this COVID crisis that we are all living. So please, Spiros, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Mona, and for your kind words. Actually, my name is Spiridon Phlogiatis, which is a very characteristic Greek name, because it means something in Greek, but it means nothing in any other language. It is my turn to congratulate and thank the organizers for this opportunity, which gave me to participate in my capacity as law professor and director of the European Public Law Organization in this excellent panel. And I'm very happy that I was given that opportunity. Congratulations for the excellent work, and congratulations for the work you are doing in the promotion of justice and the promotion of the rule of law. I will concentrate my intervention on 2 points, Mona. The first, being a lawyer, I need to say a few words about what the rule of law is and what we can expect from that concept to help us in modern societies. And secondly, to concentrate on the issue of the crisis which we're going through, and to see how this rule of law can be preserved or cannot in times of a crisis. So as the lawyers, all of us, we know, the concept of the rule of law was brought to common knowledge at the beginning of 1900 by a distinguished law professor at Oxford University, A.V. Dicey, who wrote a book, An Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution. And he elaborated on the idea of what the rule of law is, and that the rule of law is the main component of the British Constitution. And the central element of the idea is that the state is not free from the law, is not legibus solutus. The state is sovereign in producing the law, but as soon as the law is produced, the state is subjected to that law and cannot escape from it. Nobody escapes from the law, including the state which creates the law. That was the idea, and of course, this idea went around the world, and every state and every society contributed to the development of that concept. In modern times, the concept of the rule of law left the strict legal framework in which it developed, and went into the social sciences and to the political science, especially through an exceptional document, which was the Administrative Procedure Act 1946 of the United States, where the rule of law was better analyzed, and the ideas of accountability, transparency, openness, fight against transparency, and others were introduced. And so the rule of law became a very important element of modern public life. So to come to the times of crisis, the rule of law in the times of crisis, what my colleague Michel explained to us about Moldova or about Ukraine, we have been through exceptional circumstances, and the states were not prepared for that. They lived after the Second World War more or less in situations of stability, of normality. And all of a sudden, a year from now, a year ago, I remember I saw on real time Le Président Macron taking, I believe he was the first leader on the continent who took the floor and said, you know, we are before exceptional circumstances, and I, the state, la République Française, I have the duty to protect the citizens, and I will take measures for that. because I am the guarantor of the public service. And then I said to me, I am a lawyer, I cannot escape from that. I said, this is the moment of the revival of the state. The state is coming back and wants to be seen as regulating the life. And it is not by a capricious initiative that the state wants to come back. It is because it is needed for the state to come back. The peoples want protection, expect protection. They need protection. However, as we have seen also through the examples, protection may put in jeopardy the human rights or democracy. We have seen elections which did not take place, elections which were postponed. And they were postponed, at least for those elections which I know, because it was impossible to have them. It was impossible to have them when the half of the population was in lockdown situation. And then we had a very important threatening to several human rights of the patients, of the population, and the idea of the balance of interests, and the idea of proportionality had a new meaning in this year of the exceptional year of emergency which we have been through. I'm sure that in several cases, the societies and the states have succeeded into keeping the balance and the proportionality. And I'm equally sure that in many other cases, the states and the societies were not able to do it, or they found ways to escape from the rule of law, and for all sorts of reasons, which we know in modern public life. Corruption is there to be hidden under the emergency measures and the need for emergency interventions, and all other sorts of distortion of democracy. I will refrain myself of keeping the floor more, because I see that 10 minutes have already been spent. And of course, I'm there to discuss any aspect of what I tried to put forth during my short intervention. Thank you very much, Mona, and thank the organizers again, and congratulations for the excellent work you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Spiros. And we can see from your intervention, you know, we are talking to a professor who has been really in the legal field for a very long time. We started from the dicey and went and came to the modern time through the development of administrative law. But what the point I want to take from it is your focus on the importance of accountability, because you spoke a lot about the necessity, the proportionality. Are these measures necessary? Are they proportionate? Many states have got it right, as you say, but some didn't get it right. And I'm in the Human Rights Office, and that's part of and parcel of what we do every day, is to look at who got it right and who didn't get it right, and what kind of policies that are there. But I think the point that you make is that the important point is that we need systems for this accountability. That, you know, without mechanisms and systems of accountability, the state that is coming back, I think, strongly, because on the back of the pandemic, has to also make sure that there are adequate checks and balances. So I think you raised very, very important issues there, and I think we need to keep them in mind as the conversation.
If I may, Mona, just one word. I'm sure that after the pandemic is over, several societies around the globe will be shaken by the need for accountability.
Yeah.
I'm sure about that.
Yeah, no, and I think thank you for reminding us of this, because of course we learned this the hard way, that measures that are put in exceptional circumstances sometimes linger on for decades. So that's really an important point. Our next speaker is Corinne. Excuse me, sorry. Is Corinne Varga. She is my colleague in the United Nations. She works with the International Labour Office. She's the director of the International Labour Standards Department, and I'm really, really happy to have her there, because the ILO is really leading on technical advice on comparative labor law and international labor standards to governments through their very unique tripartite system of working with governments, with the employers, and with the employees, with the unions, organizations. So I think really you have, and during this time, I think labor during the confinement has really been a big issue. So Corinne, please, you have the floor, and tell us, what did you learn during this time, during this crisis, and how we can build back better out of this crisis.
Thank you so very much, Mona, my fellow panelist, and to the organizer. I'm really, really pleased to be taking part in this important conversation about the rule of law in these troubled times. And I would like to structure my few remarks around three main key points. And my first point would really relate to a lot of what had been said, and in particular by Wivin. I have to say that I could relate to every single word she said in terms of the perspective of the ILO towards this question of rule of law in this time of crisis. And as has been said, rule of law is really about equality. And equality before the law, and therefore it's really a critical factor for maintaining solidarity and social cohesion and resilience in face of crisis. And from that perspective, I want to highlight the fact that the realization of SDG 16, which is about peace, justice, and strong institutions, is really specifically interdependent with the SDG 8, which is about decent work and economic growth. Decent work, it's about promoting the rule of law in the world of work and good governance in the world of work. It's about right-based policies to the world of work. It relies, as you said, on international labor standards, which embody universal human rights and bring them to the reality of the world of work. And here we're talking the right to freedom from slavery, freedom of association, non-discrimination, the right to occupational safety and health, the right to social security, the right to a living wage, and a host of a wide range of other rights. So my point here, I guess, is really that I want to be stressing this close relationship between SDG 8 and SDG 16. And I'm making this point as we are heading ahead of the high-level political forum, which is going to be meeting soon, and which is going to be reviewing a number of SDGs, including SDG 8 and 16. And I would really invite member states to reflect on the interconnectivity of these rights and of these SDGs. So that was really my first point. My second point I would focus on the crisis and the impact of the crisis on progress made towards SDGs. And I'll start with an example. Last year, we've been so thrilled by celebrating the first ever universal ratification of the worst forms of child labor convention, Convention 182. It was a first world. And as we were celebrating in parallel to that moment of joy, we were witnessing the severe impact of the crisis on the tremendous progress we have been collectively able to achieve towards eliminating or reducing, not yet eliminating, child labor. And in particular, its worst forms, where we find still today 66 million of children falling in extreme poverty. So the risk of going backwards on progress achieved over the last decades in this very, on this very question of child labor, the right to be free from, the right of children to be free from having to work to escape from poverty, is really a harsh wake-up call in terms of the severe impact the crisis can have on progress achieved so far in terms of advancing decent work and labor standards. So really, in front of these risks, severe risk, and some of them we are more than risk. I mean, we're really witnessing some reverse trends in some of these areas in terms of labor standards, calls on our common responsibility. We have a common responsibility to tackle this problem and demonstrate that that we are in solidarity, acting together to prevent any retrograde measures that may strip large portions of populations from the protection of the law. So to conclude on my second point, I think we should be really mindful of the risk of the crisis generating a downward spiral in labor condition and our ability to pursue what I would call a virtuous cycle of recovery and development based on the rule of law and right-based recovery. A point that had been made by some earlier panelists, which is an important one, is that while we have seen that some derogations from international obligation had taken place, it's important to recall that these measures should only be exceptional and exercised within the limit of legality, necessity, proportionality, and non-discrimination, as has been mentioned. And this is really something we are monitoring very closely at the ILO, all these reverse trends to make sure that whenever exceptions to full compliance with international treaties were observed, action is taken to make sure that they remain proportionate, limited in time, and stop as soon as possible. And then my third and last point will also resonate with something Wevin introduced, which she called participation. In our ILO jargon, we call social dialogue. And social dialogue, and I want to say a few words about the important role of social dialogue and the rule of law if we are serious about ensuring a human-centered recovery. I think Wevin made the point very powerfully. I just want to add an ILO perspective on what she said and just stress that if we want the COVID policy responses to be inclusive and trusted, they will need to be grounded in the respects for rights of work and also to embedded in national circumstances and benefiting from local ownership. This is really extremely important if we want to redress a trend I think we're observing worldwide of wide distrust in policymakers, in politicians, and in public institutions. If we are serious about redressing and addressing that risk, we need to be putting in place social dialogue mechanisms, participation mechanisms that are fully inclusive. And I can only but agree with what had been said about bringing the voice of all those concerns. And when it, from an ILO perspective, this means bringing in the workers that are less visible from many, those working in rural areas, informal economy, the migrant workers, indigenous people, domestic workers, often invisible. And you would understand that I would also say, and women in particular, wherever they work. The question of violence and increase in violence has been mentioned, and I also want to come back to that. we have adopted a groundbreaking convention against violence and harassment in the world of work. Last year, we are seeing now a huge number of member states expressing interest in ratifying. So we're starting to get ratification by a wide range of member states. And for Wevin in particular as well, not that I want to spot her in my remarks, but it's just that I think we're speaking one to another quite directly. African countries are really pushing hard on the ratification of that Convention of Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. And this is really something I wanted to share with her in particular. So in conclusion, really, the rule of law and good governance is important if we are to ensure that we put a human face to the recovery policy governments are going to put into place, and if we want to secure trust of the citizens in the public policies put in place. And my very last point would be to respond to Rebecca Schutz, who puts a question in the chat, and tell her that I fully agree with her. Economic and social rights are part and parcel of human rights. And this is something we've been advocating for and working for on a daily basis in the ILO. So yes, Rebecca, you're absolutely right. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I really, again, you brought another perspective, which not another ingredients. I like the word ingredients. I'm following from Justice Bingham, who actually spoke about 8 ingredients of the rule of law, and I normally kind of like put them into 5. And with my 5 speakers, it's amazing. We are just touching the 5 ingredients of the rule of law, and you really spelled out the equality one, the equality and the non-discrimination one. And you connected it to the participation, but you also connected it to the legality part and the accountability part and the transparency part. I think the transparency part is really important in all this, because I think part of what is happening today, and we all the speakers alluded to that, is that measures are being taken in a way, and we are trusting. We as citizens, we are trusting. We want to come out of this. So if the government tells us that's the way to go, we go along with it. It's just we hope that there is no abuse on the other side. So we are sitting there hoping and praying that there is no abuse on the other side, and praying for an accountability mechanism to make sure that everything is going well. So I think you brought all this, the trust factor, the exceptional circumstances factor, the equality main ingredients, and how it all has to be woven together to make us really come out of this crisis in a way that makes us stronger rather than build on the bad practices. My last speaker is another colleague, and I am really very happy to have him because he is going to emphasize another important aspect of this crisis. This is my colleague Belize Komen-Langen. He's the Chief of Development Law Office at the Food and Agriculture Organization, another UN organizations. And he brings a lot of experience, deep experience in technical legal assistance to government and developing countries and economies in transition, particularly natural resources management and legislative reform. So, and again, this, I hope you will also tell us about the food chains and what happened to people who are working in this sector, which I think has been very much struck and affected by the pandemic as we go, and how we can. I think your experience goes into fisheries and aquaculture and so on. So please tell us what is your take at this stage, Belize.
Thank you, Mona, and It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. I would like to thank IDLO and its collaborators for facilitating this panel and bringing all of us together to participate. I will focus my intervention on policy, legislative, and related processes in the area of food and agriculture, of course, which is the area of work I'm involved in at the Development Law Service of the FAO Legal Office. Particularly the role of these frameworks and processes in facilitating the continuity of food systems, which you've mentioned, Mona, and in ensuring access to healthy and nutritious food during emergencies such as COVID-19 and their aftermath. So it's not just the pandemic, but the aftermath as well. A related aspect, which I will touch on, is the need to ensure that the rule of law and human rights are protected and upheld as governments put in place emergency measures to address those situations. So similar things that you will hear, which resonates also in the area of food and agriculture and continuity of food systems and access to healthy and nutritious food. I want to start by mentioning what the Development Law Service of the Legal Office of FAO does. This is where I work, because it'll be the backdrop of my intervention and nuances the aspects I would like to remark on in this intervention. The service provides assistance to countries members of FAO, particularly developing countries, at their request through the executive arm of government, and more recently through parliamentary coalitions, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Africa. The support the service provides includes legal advice, conduct of law reviews and assistance in drafting legislation, as well as the provision of related capacity building in the area of food and agriculture and natural resource management. And natural resource here includes land, water, forests, fisheries, and aquaculture. Clearance and endorsement of the assistance that the organization provides to its member nations in the aforementioned areas is actually done by the Development Law Service. So the key early message here is that we have to work with governments, not just standing at the periphery and criticizing them, but work with them and provide them support as they negotiate the regulatory landscape in addressing emergencies. And of course, we all know that the dilemma we face in the instance of executive governments declaring state of emergencies is that in many instances, normal processes are suspended and rights are restricted to permit swift action to address the emergency. But these suspensions or restrictions do not have to occur without any regard for their negative impacts on the enjoyment of human rights. Our advice to governments, therefore, is that there can be no total abandonment of the rule of law, nor of efforts towards guaranteeing human rights. And this should be on the onset of an emergency and the need to institute emergency declarations, as well as the aftermath. And on the institution of emergency declarations, that also implies for us, because this is a great power exercised by the executive arm of government, it implies, in fact, for us, the responsibility of those authorities to exercise greater caution, indeed to do no harm, and to reflect and plan for emergencies even before they occur. So having good laws that anticipate emergencies and their corresponding responses and recovery efforts should be part of countries' emergency response plans. So stakeholders should be consulted, and we've had this by the colleagues that have spoken before me, and we have to give the chance for these stakeholders to actively participate in policy and lawmaking processes that ensure the availability of accessibility to healthy and nutritious food in line with states' international obligations to guarantee the fundamental right to be free from hunger and ensure the realization of the right to adequate food for all, especially for vulnerable groups. Emergency responses, including regulatory ones, should be underpinned by key principles of transparency, and we've had colleagues already say this: inclusive participation, gender equality, non-discrimination, and accountability. in particular to ensure the protection of the most vulnerable populations, such as women, even focusing on pregnant women and girls, low-income households with young children, jobless workers, etc. Leaving no one behind during pandemics implies establishing and implementing targeted responses to address the needs and specific challenges of those vulnerable populations. So I would like to now turn to two concrete examples in regulatory responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery phase in specific areas of FAO's mandate, which highlight the essential considerations that I've already mentioned. So these two examples are in the area of school food and nutrition and access to natural resources in the fisheries sector. For the example of school food and nutrition, the context is that for most vulnerable families, school meals are often the only food for children during the day. More than 350 million school children in countries with nationwide and localized closures during the pandemic suffered from an interruption to their access to regular food at school and nutrition services. Emergency measures during the pandemic, we believe, cannot compromise human rights of children in this way. So legislation should ensure that school feeding programs keep functioning by introducing exceptions to movement restrictions for actors involved in the operation of these programs, or allowing for flexibility, such as by delivering meals directly to families. Also, rules should be established to expand emergency food assistance through different means, such as temporary suspension of administrative requirements that lead to restrictions of eligibility. So in this context and beyond, accountability mechanisms, we've heard already about this, are core elements of the SDG 16, and complaint mechanisms to denounce behaviors that violate human rights, they are essential. The second example now, which I would like to mention, concerns the access to natural resources in the fisheries sector. And this underscores the importance of targeted measures to protect women's rights and to protect indigenous peoples who depend on access to these resources for their livelihoods. So emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbate pre-existing conditions of inequality for those already exposed to food insecurity and malnutrition, and those who are already vulnerable working in vulnerable working conditions as a result of marginalization and discrimination in the sector. So legislative responses that we have explored and worked with governments from a gender perspective, for example, should establish mechanisms to provide sex-disaggregated data to ensure a socioeconomic assessment of the impact of the pandemic on women, to facilitate the adoption of gender-responsive measures, and to design gender-equitable fisheries and aquaculture policies in the aftermath. Also, they should establish mechanisms to ensure women's access to information and equal participation in response planning and decision-making processes affecting the fisheries and aquaculture sector. I could go on, but I'm just highlighting a few of these examples of the important considerations. For indigenous peoples, there is a worrisome trend of lowering the legal safeguards in the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples regarding their access to natural resources in the context of the response to COVID-19. And legislation should establish specific measures to protect and respect the rights of indigenous peoples, consulting traditional governance mechanisms on emergency responses, and respecting free, prior, and informed consent, and avoiding any discriminatory practices that might affect any group, including those already infected by COVID-19. So in closing, Mona, I would like to stress the importance of planning ahead and preparing for ways to ensure that human rights are guaranteed and the rule of law is upheld in times of emergencies. Focusing more on areas I deal with, there are important considerations that ought to be factored in when adopting emergency measures if no such planning ahead has taken place, as their negative impact can quickly mean life or death for many people that are faced with food insecurity and malnutrition. Therefore, weighing the impact of emergencies on the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger and the realization of a right to adequate food for all, especially of vulnerable people, are two basic considerations to be kept in mind if decision makers adopt measures mitigating the impact of the pandemic on the health situation. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Really, thank you. I think you brought in a lot of very practical examples, and I have to say very moving examples. I mean, the example of school meals for children, I think it's really amazing. And the practical way of like basically saying, even these have to be delivered even in exceptional circumstances, and it is the duty on the state to think of these things. You know, the delivery modes can be different for different countries depending on the measures that are there, but the bottom line is that the child has to eat, because it might be his only or her only meal of the day. And I think I really like the practicality of it, and I like your emphasis on planning, because I think perhaps that's the organizing aspect of the rule of law. It's not an ingredient, it's the organizing. So it gives us, you have to plan it. It cannot happen haphazardly. It has to be conscious. You have to go after it in a very conscious way. And I really love how you talked about food as a human right. And I think you brought it in a very strong way. So thank you for very much. And the issues around indigenous is really important, because we did also some analysis in our office and some lessons learned, and we find that sometimes they are amongst the most left behind. So the emphasis on free, prior, and informal consent and the reminder of these principles is very important, because they are amongst the most vulnerable of the vulnerable communities. So thank you very much for all this. So the panelists have really provoked quite a number of questions. So we have already two, and I think one is coming. So there was one about health as a human right, and I think Corina, but I think Michelle yourself, I think you mentioned quite a few examples of health as a human right. So I want to put that and economic and social and cultural rights. I belong to the Office of the High Commissioner. So of course, for us, these are core human rights and not only human rights. And we saw this in the pandemic. And actually in this pandemic, we saw how the interplay between, how the dependency between rights, you know, that one right, you cannot just say civil rights or political rights, because political decisions actually, if you don't participate, and affect food and education and health. And so everything is so interconnected. And we saw that in the pandemic. So that was the first question. And the second question I see is on accountability, and whether how do we enhance governmental accountability in these circumstances, and how some of the measures clearly are justified, and I don't think anybody denies that, but how do we ensure that they are proportionate, are necessary, and they are not excessive? And I think I have a third question, which I'm trying to read right now. By the way, panelists, please, I'm going to ask you who would like to answer the question. So please come in a minute, but just to remind also the audience of the third question. This is from an Italian law student. You are very welcome. And she, I can't see the name, no, Martina, so it's a she. So Martina is interested in the question of digital transformation to help integrate and improve SDG 16 and the link with SDG 8. So these three areas, indivisibility of rights, accountability of governments, and the digital transformation aspect of our discussion. Who would like to take the floor? Just unmute and just say, I would like to take the floor.
Yeah. So I was actually just typing a response, and in my perspective, I feel like digital transformation offers an opportunity for more groups to be included and for more groups to participate in political and decision-making processes because of its potential to reach many people at the same time. However, as it stands right now, digital transformation is only widening inequalities and enabling violence because there is limited access to digital spaces. There aren't enough and conclusive cybersecurity laws and policies. And even with access, there's also minimal digital literacy. So once these challenges and gaps are addressed in digital spaces, I believe that digital transformation can address a lot of the gaps that we face right now and a lot of the gaps in regards to inequality, gender equality, and peace and security.
And if I may pick up on...
Yes, please, Corinne.
On what has been said about digital transformation, I think it does indeed bring opportunities, as has been mentioned. And as always, when you have opportunities, it comes along with risks. And I just wanted to also draw our attention to the risk factor, at least from an employment and labor perspective. First, there is this digital divide that we need to be addressing. We are not all equal in terms of the adaptability to this digital transformation. And it's also affecting quite severely the organization of the world of work. We are seeing now more and more service rendered through digital platforms. And this is challenging big times the way traditionally the actors of the world of work are organizing themselves, dialoguing between themselves and voicing their concerns. So there is also, it challenges also the participation model that we traditionally relied on. And if I can pick the question on account, how do we increase states' accountability? Just to draw the attention to the fact that at least for within the ILO, we have what we call a supervisory system. So we have mechanisms that have been in place now for nearly a decade, whereby we have part of our system that enables complaints-based procedures. And we have received, since the outbreak of the crisis, a number of complaints pointing to failure by member states to respect their international obligation in respect of certain international labor standards. And so those mechanisms are there and are being used as well to hold member states accountable. So that's all I wanted to throw in the discussion at this point in time.
If I may jump in, two reactions on the digital tools. This is something that we have been promoting long before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation agenda in a lot of countries. Suddenly these reforms, that were being planned, but kind of slowly, and suddenly they have become priorities, and governments are extremely keen to put in place these digital tools to ensure better services and better monitoring of services to their citizens. And on the accountability of governments, I think it is a matter for constitutional law of each country, how you address, the possibility of governments to limit civil liberties, but most countries have that in their constitution. They have rules that will define how far the government can go when there is a state of emergency. But we have heard the word, the buzzwords of proportionality, and a time limitation for all these measures. So I think this is more a matter for internal legislation of the relevant countries.
If I may, Mona, may I intervene?
Of course.
Following exactly what Michelle just said, I believe that the best guarantee for the societies and the citizen in terms of accountability, in times of the state, in times of crisis, is that according to our constitutional systems around the globe nowadays, the governments should not forget that the time of the end of the pandemic always comes. And when the pandemic will be over, then the society and the opposition in parliament, the NGOs will start digging into the practices which have been followed during the pandemic. And so this threat is the best guarantee for this threat to governments is the best guarantee for the citizen during pandemics. That the knowledge that the time will come when the pandemic will be over and the society will review all the practices followed and all the contracts offered and all the measures taken. And I believe that we will see that after the pandemic, several governments will not survive from the pandemic. Of course, I wish that everyone does the job very well and properly, and so I want to believe, but we will see at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have actually received, I want to add few other questions because we have actually received some questions in advance. And I just want to give you the essence of it, and maybe we can come back to some of the issues. So some questions are about accountability, again, coming back to how, this is a question from Uganda. I don't want to mention the name, but it's a question from Uganda talking about how do we deal with abuse to the rule of law by states due to restrictions put in place to prevent spread of COVID, and how do we restore the rule of law? There is another question coming from Kenya about the balance between government's obligation to govern citizens' rights and access to justice during the pandemic. Another question coming from Lebanon speaks about the evolution of governance reforms in the post-conflict, COVID-19 phase. So it's all goes into this, basically citizens people are putting their faith in governments right now, but they are wary that maybe the governments are abusing this exceptional power and worried about whether these exceptional rules become the norm after that. How do we ensure that we go back to full rule of law and full functioning constitutional and rule of law systems, and what we lived? We take the good part of what we lived and really we leave the exceptional part behind, which I think will be a real challenge. Any views on that? Who would like to come in? Who would like to comment?
Mona, the place here, I'll
Please,
start.
please.
And I appreciate those questions because they actually link to Martina's questions earlier on, especially in relation to digitalization and ensuring accountability. So one of the things that we in the Development Law Service of FAO are doing is ensuring that you have legal information provided, right? Without legal information and access to this information, then how do you know which rights are yours and how you enforce them? So it's always a challenge presenting legal information in sound bites that makes it accessible as well as make it comprehensible to those who are not normally in the business of interpreting laws and ensuring that they enforce their rights. But reducing them to a point where it can be digestible by the common person on the street or in rural areas, this would be something that I think will go a long way. I cannot really offer any any solutions for now, but I think there is an opportunity for using digitalization, developing applications that will ensure that this kind of legal information, especially on their rights, is at the fingertips of the normal, reasonable, and rural person, such that they can then say, "Oh, these are what is ours. This is our rights," and then they can find the solutions, or find who can help them. So legal information should also include information as to what are services out there they can access to ensure that they enforce their rights. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I want to address in terms of accountability is the process itself. So law and, well, emergency laws is not just about the content, but also about the process. And of course, in times of emergencies, it's hardly a kind of situation where you want to do consultations. So this is why I emphasize, that we have to focus on the before rather than the after. And if we can ensure that stakeholders are involved in the process of ensuring that emergency laws bears attention to, or gives attention to human rights and the principles of the rule of law, then you would be in a way assured that the law itself and the impact will be something that is legitimate, and they will force the government. We're having worked with the government. Their views will be taken on board, and therefore the government having or working with stakeholders would be already tuned in to the mindset and the circumstances of those that are offering their views in the lawmaking process. Of course, it's easier said than done. And the challenge is always there to ensure that the right stakeholders are involved. But just looking at the process on ensuring consultation, ensuring participation is already a start.
Thank you, Belize. I think that's really an interesting point, because it goes down to the legitimacy, because trust and legitimacy and transparency all work together, I think. And I think what you are actually talking about is the legitimacy of the measures in the eyes of the public. Now, I have another question that came in, and maybe we can address it and actually it relates to something that was mentioned before, which is about the data. So the question goes into the technological innovations from the panelist perspective, and the people-centered data and the SDG 16. I actually very much believe that this digitalization, while it's very important, actually creates two-tier or more than two-tier systems. Sometimes when I am in one country, my internet connection is so perfect, so I can communicate with you all. I go to another country just across the border, and then I cannot communicate with anybody else. So we are so dependent on the digitalization that I think it's very important to reflect on how does it really impact all our rights. And I think the digital divide is really essential. And I am in Europe, and I'm between two countries that are both very advanced. One is a city and one is a village. So that also plays a role. When I'm in a city, I work differently. When I'm in Geneva, I work differently than when I am in a village in another country. That's really very different. So, and it's the same everywhere, I guess. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So that digitalization, and maybe you can use this opportunity, because we are running a bit out of time, to take to have your last word on what you heard also from other panelists. So please take the floor, and I will start in the opposite order from where we started, to answer this last question, but also to take the floor for your concluding remarks. So I start with you, Belize, please.
Really well, but I wanted to say I agree with Wavin's comments regarding participation and ensuring that information goes down to the right people, those who are actually the subjects of the regulations that were put in place, and also in the other way, we need to know the information about those that are being regulated, those whose rights are being affected, so that they feed into ensuring that when we do have the opportunity to review laws, that they do reflect the situations and take and are adjusted to to ensuring that the rights are protected. Then there was something that we all shared, the panelists shared, and which I want to emphasize again, the fact that we need to know information about the emergency laws and the fact that these emergency laws are time-bound, that they shouldn't be continued beyond the emergency. And we should look to ending those laws or emergency situations much sooner rather than later. And to continue those beyond what is necessary is not something that we should encourage. And my last point would be something that I mentioned earlier, and it also may be valid for the point about digitalization, is complaint mechanisms. You know, we have to have in place accessible complaint mechanisms and mechanisms, the complaint mechanisms that will be acted upon, and not just at a mailbox that you deposit complaints in. So I think those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Corinne, your turn.
Yes, thank you. I was
last words.
Searching for the unmute. Yeah, and I want to bring in my last point a global perspective, not to suggest at all that the local perspective is not important or critical. It is. But this question about how do we ensure state accountability is still with me. In addition to empowering people, which is a critical first ingredient, I think it's important as well for us to ensure a revitalized multilateral cooperation between states. And I think we've seen the tension within the multilateral system, but the multilateral system, with all its weaknesses and areas of improvement and all the rest, has nevertheless created a space of state accountability one against each other, and in support of people's voice at country level. And so I think my last point is really, we should be really supportive of all these efforts to revive, strengthen the multilateral cooperation between member states and the mechanism behind that, because they also play an important role in safeguarding people's right. So that would be my last comment.
Thank you, Corinne. Spiros?
Thank you, Mona. Concerning digitalization, I would like to say a few words in those closing remarks. We are used to think of digitalization for what concerns its advantages and also the dangers for the modern humans and democracy. The pandemic has taught us all the same that the digitalization is a very important tool for humans to come together and to continue working even in situations of confinement. We are grateful to digitalization, because without digitalization, this meeting, this very discussion that we're having today could not take place. At the same time, we learned from the times of pandemic that digitalization does not truly substitute the true need of democracy and of the human beings to come together physically, to debate, to exchange ideas, and to progress the society together. Nothing replaces true life. And I will be much more happier today to be with all of you around the table. And I'm sure that our physical interaction would produce even more results out of our consciousness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Michel?
Very briefly, I think what I learned today is that we all need to be vigilant in the current pandemic context to make sure governments do not curtail the rule of law more than necessary. And if they need to do that, then it should be limited in time and subject to review by parliaments, by courts, under the close watch of civil society and international organizations. Now, I appreciate that this ideal approach will be easier to implement in countries with well-functioning democracies than with countries with authoritarian regimes. But anyway, this is the ideal we should all aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Waven?
Thank you. I'd just like to conclude my remarks with something one of my friends told me, that the government is the real pandemic. And I'd like us to reflect on this because of how government is responding to the pandemic. And I see technology as an opportunity to really document these injustices and document these responses, because once we are past the emergency phase, a time is coming where we really have to seek justice for victims who have suffered under, oppressive regimes and where the rule of law has not been upheld. Finally, I'd like to pose a challenge to everyone, all of us, that we need to start reimagining the way governance looks like, and reimagining security, reimagining justice, because we are never going back to normal, and things will change. Technology is going to take over. Digital transformation is going to get even more urgent. So systems that are physical, like the courts, prisons, how do we reimagine justice in the context that we are in right now? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think that's really a very important and sober point to end with, that there is a day after. What this day after looks like is really, at this stage, frankly, is also in our hands. We cannot go back to yesterday's world or last year's world. We learned a lot during this year, more than a year and a half almost now, a year and 2 months. We've been thinking a lot of the health of individuals, but I think the challenge for us is to think of the health of our societies and the health of our communities, not only the physical health and mental health of individuals. We didn't talk about mental health, but mental health is really a big issue in this pandemic, and really has been such a huge issue. So the mental health of societies and the physical health of individuals, and how we are building better in this way. So thank you so much for a very, very rich panel, very rich discussion, incredibly forward-looking, and I'm really very privileged that I was asked to moderate it. Thank you, IDLO. You've been really the star in this by bringing us all together and allowing this space and this platform to take place. So thank you, and to be continued. This is just the beginning of a very important conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.